brilliant. Right, let's see if we can get this back to where it should be. So that's more like what it's meant to be. That's a bit closer, without the mistakes. I think what I want to talk about today is the whole concept of groove. Because as you can tell, I'm not too fond of grids. And a lot of what the music that we've grown up listening to has certainly there was a kind of time sort of towards the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, when sort of click tracks became really dominant because of the role of computers in music and the fact that computers at the time weren't particularly movable. And suddenly everything got shifted onto a 16 subdivision grid. Everything in pop music anyway, for quite a while. And a lot of that was because the dominant sequences at the time had no ability to quantize outside of that. There wasn't any, if you use any sequencing software now, there's variable quantize, and you can add feel and groove and all kinds of effects to it. If you use FL Studio, you can add swing and you can add hue and feel. Same in Logic or Ableton. But back then you couldn't. There was a sequencer called the MC500, which was very, very common, and it was just a 16-note grid. And so a lot of music kind of shifted to that, and music that is that bang on the beat, where everything is kind of sitting on top of that grid, there's a very small tempo range in which that really works. And it's kind of 10 BPM either side of sort of standard house music tempo, about 120. So it's somewhere between about 105 and 130 BPM. Stuff sat right bang on top of the grid sounds amazing. But you slow it down too much and it sounds really rigid, and you speed it up too much and it just sounds like it's been sped up. It doesn't sound like it's meant to be at that tempo. And it took a long time. Mice in this place are ridiculous. Somebody needs to sort that out. So it took a long time for the interplay between technology and musicians to catch up. And the one thing that was running along parallel with this, that was completely changing the way that we think about rhythm, was hip-hop. And the reason that hip-hop changed this was because it was a combination of two things. It was a combination of pre-click track grooves being sampled and human error. Because at the time when hip-hop started as a kind of sampled format, all the sampling was happening live with turntables, that you would have two copies of the same record with the same breakbeat on them. So that was the drum groove that you wanted to use. And the DJ was someone who with a crossfader was playing the groove on one, and while that two bar break was playing, he was queuing up the next one so that as soon as it finished, he could let go of that, slide the crossfader across, and then keep doing that and going backwards and forwards. So what every DJ had was they had their own swing to how they switched the groove. They had their own way of the interplay between them, that all of a sudden DJs had feel. And the feel was all about how far they deviated from that grid, how much of a kind of a gap there was between the two grooves stopping and starting, whether or not you actually heard the deck slow down as the beat finished, and then the other one kick in. So suddenly we had human error became a part of the signature of the way that groove worked. And as hip-hop got more complex and they started layering samples, what you then had was grooves with completely different feels, because again, they were mostly sampling old James Brown records and like weird Afrobeat things from the 70s that had these incredibly loose feels on them. And so suddenly we had all of this pre-click track and music from outside of Europe and North America being sampled and layered in ways that meant that the groove was a composite. That rather than groove being a grid that everything sat on, that was just events placed in a chain, the groove as we felt it was a composite of how lots and lots of different musicians felt groove without the need for them to be pulled in on top of one another. Can you see how those two are completely different ways of thinking about rhythm? And so one of the things that happened to me when I started looping was that I started out doing what everybody does, which is trying to play things strictly in time. And what I realized was that when I was on top of the grid, within seconds, the loop was heard as a backing track. It was no longer a thing that I was interacting with. It wasn't that element within hip-hop that made hip-hop interesting. There was no characteristic to it that I was trying to, that was kind of becoming part of the music. It was just a four-square, solid, fairly dull backing track that I was then playing over. And there was no difference between me doing that and me playing to a track. It didn't feel like it was actually doing anything new. So right from the start, I saw my looping stuff as distinct from my job when I'm playing sessions and actually doing what was required, and often that did require sitting on top of the grid. But when I was playing other people's music, that in my own I was able to experiment with incorporating elements of hip-hop and R&B and electronica and chamber music in the way that classical music has always been stretchy time. But starting to do that, and then use the technology to actually experiment with this whole idea of layered complexity that came directly from hip-hop, and start to see how multiple layers of different time and different things landing in different places could work like that. So you could hear in that last thing that within that first drum groove, I missed one of the kick drums right at the start. So I put it back in on the way back round, and it came back in at a different place. So suddenly there's this really wonky overlap at the end of the groove. So I smudged it and smeared it like you would if it was a work of art. Like I treat sound like Photoshop. So cymbals are great because they're like the smudge tool in Photoshop. You go over the end of the loop, and suddenly it starts to make sense. Suddenly there's this, that rather than there being a gap, there's this kind of flow from one side to the next. And then I layered the bass part over the top, which again was landing at different places in the groove. And all of this is nicked from, most of it is nicked from a hip-hop producer that was around at the end of the 90s and into the kind of first part of the new millennium, called Jay Dilla. Anybody come across Dilla? Any Dilla fans here? Yeah. Astonishing producer. Worked on, very heavily influenced the first couple of D'Angelo records. Produced Mama's Gun, I think, for Erykah Badu. Amplified the Q-Tip and a whole bunch of stuff, but completely changed the way that R&B sounded. So if you listen to a Teddy Riley production from the mid-90s, and then you listen to pretty much anything that happened in R&B after 2000, all of that wonkiness came from Dilla. Because he would sit and play in all his own beats, that rather than, he would take a sample and he would chop it up and replay all the sections. And there was always this kind of human element to what he was doing. And he recognized that it was that brokenness that made grooves interesting. So D'Angelo's Voodoo, which is one of my top 5 records that changed my life, is the sound of Questlove on drums and Pino Palladino on bass, or Raphael Sadiq on bass in some of the tunes. Basically emulating the sound of Dilla's screwed up beats as live musicians. So I went, great, I can do that, because that's the sort of level of hubris that I work with. Those are the greatest musicians ever. Great, well, I'll just copy them. Brilliant. And so I was able to start absorbing bits of that into what I do. And so when it came time to do this new record, having kind of got into the sample thing, the template for what I was trying to do was already in place. I'd been doing it for 15 years with just a bass. So I was really interested in what happened when I stick percussion sounds on that, because what happens when you start using percussion sounds is that people expect a certain kind. The expectation of the audience has shifted completely. They kind of expect it to be a bit more grid-like. And I think that my willingness to push that came a lot from working with Andy, because Andy will play drums like they're a melody instrument. That if when we're playing together, when we're playing as a trio with me, Andy, and Fi sometimes, that if the groove isn't obvious in what I'm doing, or there's a loop that's squished, then Andy will play cymbals and toms and whatever he's hitting at the time, as though he's the melody instrument, and so kind of ride completely across that sense of groove, and then pull it back in. Or he'll force a groove that goes right across what's going on before. So that bravery to do that, to make that work, and to not feel like everything has to sit on top of that grid, that's one of the huge things. I mean, there's all kinds of things I've learned from playing with Andy, but that's one of them. The bravery to do that and to allow things to kind of to be wonky and to line up in odd ways, because that's where the interestingness is. There's the title of one of the 2 new records is called A Crack Where the Light Gets In. And it's taken from a line from a Leonard Cohen song that says, there's a crack in everything, it's how the light gets in. And that idea that brokenness is where the interesting things come from is very, very central to a huge amount of what I do. I'm not interested in, because apart from anything else, if you play instrumental music of this kind of type, sort of diatonic nice things, if there's everything that sits on top of the grid, it just sounds like a TV theme. Which is great if you get commissioned to write TV themes, there's a lot of money in that. But that's not what I wanted my records to sound like. I didn't want to sound like I was writing incidental music for CBeebies. Any questions? Oh, listening very intently, that's very nice. Either that or you're asleep. I mellowed you all to death. Any questions at this point? Great, I'll play another tune then. So the difference between these 2 basses, anyone want to tell me?
There's open flatness.
Yeah. So So this one here, it's fretless, it has very clear lines in it, because the idea of an unlined fretless instrument makes no sense to me at all. I had a cello for years, and the reason I never used it was I never got around to getting lines drawn on it. Because why make life difficult for yourself? I want to make it as simple as possible. If I could get braille dots on the back that help me play more in tune, I'd do that as well. That's the other big influence on the new record is getting deeper inside what the chaos pad will do. So all of that kind of insect noise in the background. So let's do a thing, a bit like I was playing when you came in. Because one of the things that I'm loving about the Cuneo is that I can use keyboard sound. Oh, what happened there? Don't go weird on me. Oh, that's better. Yes, so I can play piano on it, which is quite fun. So let's do a thing with that. Oh.